Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, a focus on climate change education at Tulane. I'm Robin Forman, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost of Tulane University, and that means that I serve as Tulane's Chief Academic Officer, and it's wonderful to have so many of you join us for this important topic. What makes climate change such an important topic is also what makes it so challenging. It cuts across all scales, from the immediate to the long term, from the personal to the global, and it touches and endangers every facet of life. And it cuts across all academic perspectives. There's no academic discipline that's not faced with questions emerging from climate change and its consequences, or which does not have the potential to make significant contributions to our understanding of the mechanisms and impacts of climate change. And Tulane is working across disciplines. And tonight we'll focus on how some of our scholars are creatively exploring climate change in our curriculum and in the larger student experience. So tonight we'll hear from faculty from the School of Liberal Arts, Science and Engineering, the ByWater Institute, and the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South at Tulane University. Our expertise on this topic of climate change, and especially the consequences for coastal urban areas, extends beyond those units across the entire campus, including the schools of law, business, public health and tropical medicine, and architecture. And in future webinars, we'll hear from experts from some of those areas. Tonight, we are truly privileged to have Rebecca Snedeker moderating the discussion. Rebecca is the James H. Clark Executive Director of the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South, where she supports research, teaching, and programming that focuses on New Orleans and the Gulf South and this region's relationship to the world. She's inspired by a belief in human rights and the rights of nature, passion for the Gulf South region, and place-based learning, and the power of storytelling that weaves multiple perspectives and practices. And in turn, through her scholarship and creative works and her storytelling, Rebecca inspires others. Through projects like Anthropocene River Campus, a collaborations with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, Berlin, and the annual New Orleans Center for the Gulf South Indigenous Symposium, Snedeker co-designs immersive and transdisciplinary experiences that are grounded in our surroundings and relate the local to the global. I'm very excited to kick off tonight's panel discussion, so please join me in virtually welcoming Rebecca to the stage.
Good evening. Thank you, Provost Forman, for this generous introduction, and you're welcome. And to the Provost and the leaders of this particular panel, Dean Brian Edwards of the School of Liberal Arts, Dean Kimberly Foster of Science and Engineering, and ByWater Institute Director Mark Davis for your leadership in cultivating the rich ecosystem of researchers at Tulane whose work addresses climate change, coastal research, and civic engagement. I also want to thank the Office of Advancement for organizing this panel and welcoming all of us together. At the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South, we believe that the more we understand about where we are, the more fully we can engage in our democracy and collective destiny. So I want to begin this evening with a site acknowledgement to honor the place upon which Tulane is situated and the peoples who have lived here, and lay further foundation for listening to the 4 faculty members that comprise our panel this evening. These panelists bring international perspective. Yet, as you'll hear, they're also deeply rooted in New Orleans, and their research and teaching practices are grounded here in the lower Mississippi River region. We are here toward the bottom of the world's 4th longest river, which was formed in the most recent ice age. This ice age started 2 million years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. The river valley was created when immense glaciers melted and the waters cut channels in the ground underneath. We're at the end of this river on new land, only 7,000 or 8,000 years old, forged of sediment once carried by this river, spilled by a mouth that moved, and layered into deltaic lobes over time. We are here where the fresh riverine waters meet the salty Gulf of Mexico, an oceanic basin shaped by separating tectonic plates, where Gulf Stream waters now circulate, then flow into the Atlantic and towards the Arctic, and eventually mingle with all oceans of the world. On this young land, an ancient cypress swamp grew, and many people lived and traded, the Homa, Choctaw, Chitimacha, and Biloxi, among others. More recently, the land was cleared by European colonizers who drove native peoples west and south and enslaved and terrorized people of African descent. These invasive humans and multitudes of mosquitoes brought fevers. The river was dredged and locked into one course to create an industrial shipping channel that now serves multinational financial interests. Oil was discovered and thirsty refineries now line the river where plantations once stood. All along, the mighty river and hurricanes have brought routine flooding. And peoples from all over the world, north, south, east, and west, many of you who have lived here and come and gone, have come to live and exchange, labor and love, and come and go. Today, hurricane destruction, exploitation of earth resources and human labor, radical white terrorism, and pandemics are present. Yet resistance, collaboration, innovation, and joy counter these forces and prevail. Many of us at Tulane understand that our university could not be more perfectly situated to address what President Biden just referred to as the interconnected global challenges of pandemic, economy, climate change, and racial inequality. How we at Tulane respond to this nexus as educators and students, each one of us, can shape the future not only of our university, but also of this region and impact the world as well. We are one of hundreds of universities just within this nation, and yet our coastline is changing the most rapidly. Our ability to model adaptability and how we choose to respond individually and collectively will determine our future. This evening, we have a wonderful opportunity to meet 4 of the many faculty at Tulane who focus on climate change education in their teaching and practice. And our hope is to share the rich expertise that exists at our university and draw out how these teachers steward social and ecological consciousness, impacting not only their students, but also policy and the public writ large. I'm going to start by introducing each panelist, or continue, I should say, and each will give a brief introduction to their research and teaching, and then we'll move to a roundtable discussion. Audience members, please add questions to the chat section, and select questions will be addressed toward the end of the hour. And I'm going to start with introducing Törnqvist, Vokes Geology professor in the School of Science and Engineering, Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Dr. Törnqvist hails from the Netherlands as an internationally renowned geologist who has been teaching an entry-level course called Global Climate Change since spring of 2019.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for tuning in such large numbers. So yeah, I'll take a very brief explanation about my background. I'm in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, which is a department with a long history of studying the history of the Earth. And over the past few decades, a lot of the research in my department has kind of shifted increasingly towards studying climate history, because understanding past climates is really one of the keys to better predict what awaits us in the future. So I'm one of a number of people who's gotten involved in this, and my focus is pretty heavily on the coastal zone here in Louisiana in particular, which is, you know, one of the hot spots of climate change, primarily due to sea level rise and its impacts on the future of this region. So given the focus of this panel, I will say a few things about my teaching. You know, I can actually illustrate this by just talking about what I'm doing right now and what I've done this past semester. As Rebecca mentioned, I teach an introductory climate change course, which is primarily focused on climate science, but to a certain extent, we also cover climate impacts and some climate policy related issues. So that is really meant as a large kind of a broad introduction to this subject that is really aimed at non-science majors. That is something I've started doing only a few years ago, so I look forward to continuing that in the future. The other thing I do right now is, and that is something I've done for much longer, is teaching a graduate level course on paleoclimatology, which is basically climate history, where we focus primarily on the period of the ice ages, hence that background image. And this is, as I said, this is really the context for understanding our future. A lot of this focuses on ice sheets and how they relate to sea level, which is, of course, a huge issue for our region. Thank you.
And now we'll move to Josh Lewis. Josh Lewis is a research associate professor and research director at the Tulane ByWater Institute. He's previously held appointments at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology. His research focuses on the role of water infrastructure in shaping ecological conditions in urban and other human-dominated environments. Dr. Lewis works closely with local governments, community organizations, and global partners to build interdisciplinary research programs.
Hello, thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction. And as mentioned, I work at the ByWater Institute here at Tulane University, and the Tulane ByWater Institute advances applied interdisciplinary research and community engagement initiatives around coastal resilience in the urban environment. So we work with faculty across the university to cultivate collaboration in these areas. We also have a research program in the area of urban ecology and environmental management, which I lead in my capacity as the research director here. Thirdly, we also host Tulane's A Studio in the Woods program. A Studio in the Woods is a creative retreat space on the banks of the Mississippi River, downriver from New Orleans, and fosters creative responses to the key challenges of our time, like climate change, by providing retreat to artists, scholars, and the public. So what I'm gonna try to touch on tonight, I primarily do research. So my role in doing education is often with public officials, with the public in general, and with community partners, both as an educator and being educated, learning key lessons from those types of partners outside of the traditional university space. So most of this work focuses on public engagement, supporting cities in their efforts to adapt to climate change. So my current project is a 5-year collaboration with the City of New Orleans and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to support the city's efforts to adapt its water management systems using so-called green infrastructure. These techniques combine traditional stormwater management systems like pumps and canals. You can see the image here on the screen of a pump component developed by a Tulane alum, which I'll touch on later, hopefully. And combining these kind of traditional approaches to stormwater management with more ecosystem-based, nature-based solutions that are designed to store and detain and infiltrate some stormwater, relieving pressure on these kind of older traditional systems and creating more urban green space along the way. So my role is I collect actionable data for the city on the ecological effects of these projects. As you can imagine, a plan to have more standing water in the urban environment gives rise to concerns of mosquitoes, invasive plants, and the like. So I conduct ecological monitoring both in the Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans and citywide to alert project managers to potential risks and develop creative solutions to problems that may come up. And while this way of approaching research and university participation in civic life might seem a little bit untraditional, I hope to discuss in a little bit about how this approach to science and public engagement has a long legacy and history of impact here at Tulane and in New Orleans. So it's an honor to participate in this panel, and thanks for being here.
And now we'll move to Jelegat Cheruiyot. Jelegat Cheruiyot is a professor of practice in the School of Science and Engineering, Department of Ecology and Environmental Biology. Dr. Cheruiyot focuses on research related to plant, animal, and human interactions, and on teaching and mentoring students in their research and collaboration in several dynamic community engaged projects.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you everyone for joining in. So a lot of my appointment is primarily teaching. My background is on studying hyperaccumulators. So these are plants that can take up high concentrations of heavy metals from the soil and translocate them into other parts of the plant. I'm also interested in phytoremediation and ethnobotany. However, because my appointment is teaching, I enjoy teaching and I love being in a space with the students and creating a space where we can exchange knowledge. The classes I teach are diversity of life, and this is the introductory level class that we offer through our department. I also teach entomology, and we focus a lot on systematics. I teach insects and human interactions. I teach plant biology and adaptations, plants and human affairs, and conservation biology. And most of my classes also have service learning component, which really puts us into working with the local community here in New Orleans. All the topics, all the classes that I teach have a great opportunity to weave in climate change, because we can look at how, just diversity of life. You can look at how climate change has impacted the biodiversity that we have in the planet today. Insects and human interactions, we look at how different insect populations are declining because of our human activities, or we can also look at how we can use insects to answer these questions of what is changing in our climate today. When we look at plants and human affairs, we look at how plants and humans have interacted through politics, economics, in the environment. We can also look at the changes that humans we make every day because we want these plants. We can also look at, can we change the habits? Can we change how we interact with these plants, and therefore, so that we can protect our climate? If you think about coffee, for example, pretty much majority of us, we rely on coffee to just give us that perk in the morning. However, coffee is probably the most scandalous plant that you've ever met. Through history, coffee has had so much scandal, but we also can look at how much clearing, how much deforestation is happening through coffee, because we want to plant coffee, we want to efficiently harvest and transport coffee. And therefore, looking at these plants, looking at this organisms that we interact with every day, but we can also look at how much of these organisms are, our desires are driving the change in the climate. I look forward to talking more about how I incorporate these systems into my teaching, and also how we incorporate and intertwine climate change into my classes.
Now we'll move to AnnieLaurie Erickson. AnnieLaurie is an associate professor and head of photography in the School of Liberal Arts Newcomb Art Department. She's been teaching about the relationship of science and art for the past 13 years. Ms. Erickson recently received a Monroe Fellowship from the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South to conduct research and further her photographic practice on a canoe trip on the Mississippi River. She's a board member of Antenna, a crucial arts organization here in New Orleans, and serves on the advisory council for the Fossil Free Festival.
Hello, thank you, Rebecca, and everyone that tuned in. So as an artist, my work involves using experimental lens-based processes to visualize and engage with social and environmental research topics. One of my ongoing projects looks at the fossil fuel industry in our region through a photographic method that I developed that mimics the retinal afterimaging process. So the physiological phenomenon that results in an image continuing to appear in the eyes after looking at the sun or at bright objects in the dark. And I've done this through the creation of custom-built cameras and artificial retinas that are able to register these remains of light onto large format color film. And in recent years, I've focused on photographing the fossil fuel industry with my afterimaging cameras to render this toxic landscape as ghostly and kind of unearthly as these vanishing cities that should be perceived as a part of our destructive past and not something that continues to be a part of our present or our future. And this past year, I began focusing specifically on the 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, known as Cancer Alley. And I recently took a river trip on this part of the Mississippi River, as Rebecca mentioned, If you could change the slide now, that would be awesome. So I was camping and canoeing. I was also 7 months pregnant, but I traveled nonetheless down the river in Louisiana's industrial corridor in order to photograph the refineries in a new way. And I'm currently working on photographic after images from this trip that show all of the visible light of this industry in Cancer Alley. So I'm making panoramic after images of each of the petrochemical plants and then combining them into one very large, very long scroll that's meant to serve as an aestheticized document that visually represents the entirety of the industry currently dominating the stretch of the Mississippi, and that it's shown from the perspective of the river and as an after image. So ultimately, I want people to be able to see and experience this landscape in a new way, and through the imagery, along with sound and text, directly address how unsustainable this environmental extraction is. And my most recent climate change focused course offering at Tulane, Art and Activism, Rights of Nature, focuses on how art, research, and activism can be combined to bring about shifts, both in our knowledge and in our collective actions related to the environment. So I'll turn it back over to Rebecca now, and thanks so much.
Thanks everyone for those wonderful introductions. We're going to move now to a kind of roundtable of questions, and I'm seeing many questions also come in already in the chat. Please keep them coming. And I think we're going to start really broadly with just asking the panelists, what does this phrase climate change education mean to you, and how are you going about it at Tulane? And I'm wondering, Jelegat, if you'll please kick this off and possibly bring up, I loved learning about your service learning partnership with the Mardi Gras Indian Council.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. And yes, I have a partnership with the Mardi Gras Indian Chiefs Council. And so since 2019 in the spring, that I bring students to work greening the space for the Mardi Gras Indians. And we started with greening their backyard, and we've moved on to maintaining that, but also that they've given us the opportunity to create a community garden for the Mardi Gras Indians, and also for the community in the central city. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to have this space with students where we interact, but we're also creating, with greening a space, plants can act as a carbon sink. So if, what's happening and what we're seeing is that, there's a lot of the increase in greenhouse gases. Carbon is one of the greenhouse gases, nitrous oxides, one of the gases, water vapor, and methane. So by creating a green space, when we're planting, we are creating a carbon sink, because these plants will take up the carbon, and therefore, through the process of photosynthesis can then generate oxygen. So, it's not so much of the informative learning in the space, but rather than transformative. And that's how I see that space with the students, is that they're able to see the interactions that are happening and applying what we learn in theory in the classroom into real life solutions.
Thank you. And AnnieLaurie, I'm wondering if you'll please follow up talking about service learning also. And I know there's some audience members who may not know that phrase, so if you can elaborate.
Yeah. So I've taught multiple service learning classes at Tulane that work with community partners. Most recently, this has been in conjunction with an organization that I've worked with for a long time called Antenna, and Fossil Free Festival specifically. And so Fossil Free Festival is a festival of art, music, workshops, discussion that tries to envision a just transition out of the fossil-free era. So with them as our community partner, we set out to support the organizational work of the festival, but also the students designed public billboards, they helped create free educational climate change coloring books, and they created their own art exhibition to go up both on and off campus and online to reach even broader audiences. And so when I teach climate change as an artist, I position the topic kind of as as a lens through which to think about human experience, and one that can guide the undertaking of impactful artistic projects. So we start out the class, we kind of set out to absorb as much current research and information about climate change as possible through bringing in scientific experts, through reading, taking field trips, working with these community partners on their environmental activist projects. But we undertake this all under the premise that over the course of the semester, we will incorporate this knowledge into the creation of visual and sensory experiences to share things in ways that will impact an audience. So we learn across disciplinary fields. We use research as creative inspiration, and then I facilitate the process of each student finding their own voice and creating their own actions that speak to and respond to the problems that we're facing. And so I really try to harness the students' passions as the environmentally engaged young people that they tend to be, but then to make their voices clearer, more creative, and more powerful. Yeah, so I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Tor, will you jump in?
Sure. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about this introductory course, Global Climate Change, that I started teaching a few years ago. And, a couple of things I can say about it is that I always tell my students the first day we meet that my primary goal is to make them really informed citizens on this subject, and with the idea that this subject is not going to go away anytime during their lifetime. In fact, it's probably only going to become more and more important. And, with the full understanding that, all of them, most of them are going to move on and work in different areas. I really want to give them that foundation that they hopefully will benefit from, but hopefully others around them, that they can become a resource on, credible information on this subject. Now, the way I teach this class, it's a little bit unconventional in terms of, how I organize it. It's the one thing that certainly sets it apart from, given that these kinds of courses are, of course, taught at pretty much every university. My course is certainly quite focused on the specific issues in our region. And as I mentioned earlier, we're basically a hotspot of climate change within the United States and arguably even on a global scale, because we face rates of sea level rise that are, 4 times higher than what we see globally averaged. And as a result, we have these tremendous rates of coastal wetland loss happening here. So that's an important subject that I cover actually later on in the class, because we spend the first 2 months really going over all the basics. I fully assume that students come in with, little, if any, pre-existing knowledge. So as a result, we have to start off talking about things like atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, what happens in the polar regions, the role of life in the climate system, as we just heard from Jelegat. It's crucial. The interactions between the biosphere and the atmosphere are much more interesting than maybe what we thought 50 or 100 years ago. So there's a lot of things that we have to cover, and we do it without going into excessive detail, but only when we understand all these different components and how they link together, we can really fully understand what, why the wetland loss problem here in Louisiana is happening. So that's kind of a goal we work towards in the class.
And Josh, as you mentioned earlier, so much of the work you're doing is with government and community partners, not necessarily in the classroom, but in the classroom of the world. And I'm curious if you can build on what you introduced. Tulane has such an amazing legacy of just innovation and brilliant problem solving since our origins as the Louisiana University School of Medicine, just to today with all the response to COVID. So yeah, I'd love to hear you speak to what climate change education means to you with the public.
Sure. If you remember, one of the images that was up on the screen when I was talking earlier was of this huge drainage system component, part of a pump system that was developed by A. Baldwin Wood, who was a Tulane alum, class of 1899. Shout out to anybody from the class of 1899 who made it on this call. Congratulations. And this was a truly transformative technology that was developed by a Tulane alum, a Tulane engineering alum. And at the same time that A. Baldwin Wood was developing these pumping systems, the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine was being established, and the kind of sanitary movement and the public health movement and the modern drainage movement were both kind of gaining steam, and Tulane was at the forefront of both of these. So the conjoined efforts of these two schools and social movements, political movements, within about 20 years' time, so between 1900 and 1920, due to the application of sanitary and hygiene implementation in the city and the drainage system, the life expectancy of an average New Orleanian went up by 20 years. So really think about that. In only a 20-year time period, the average life expectancy in the city went up by 20 years. And that's from the decrease in tropical diseases and malaria, cholera, yellow fever, that were the conjoined results of these things. Though it's important to point out that racial disparities in death rates from these diseases remained and continue to remain, as we've seen with COVID. But I think that Tulane has a legacy and a responsibility to kind of continue these types of efforts. So these days, the problems of this purely mechanical drainage system that we used for years in New Orleans, that's still effective in certain ways, we're trying to implement more ecosystem-based strategies. So how do we use the landscape itself to absorb some of that stormwater and enhance public green space and enhance public life in New Orleans over time? So that's this project that I'm working on in Gentilly. And also important to mention, one of the key designers on this stormwater management project is also a Tulane alum, Ramiro Diaz, who's a Tulane architecture alum. The other interesting part about green infrastructure, right? So like using these green spaces, whether it's marsh creation project or restoration project along the coast, or these urban projects, is that they're much more visible and tactile versus these traditional methods of traditional engineering, right? So going to a park and seeing how these systems function is a lot different than driving by a pumping station. So, I think we have an opportunity, both our partners at the city, our partners in the federal government, and us at Tulane to really contribute to climate change adaptation methods and strategies and techniques, bringing science and data to bear in that process, and enhancing these efforts and making them impactful not only here in New Orleans, but expanding that impact beyond and really cementing and reasserting Tulane's legacy in these areas. So I'm very excited to contribute to that. And I think that there's more and more kind of participation along these lines across schools in New Orleans and at Tulane.
One of the things that struck me as I had the fortune of speaking with all the panelists before this evening and learning more about just each of you, and I just have these images of all of you out in the field and in the world, whether it's Jelegat gardening with students and elders, and AnnieLaurie on the canoe, and Josh and Gentilly, and Tor. You mentioned being out with graduate students and just in the wetlands, and also sharing the work of your graduate students with undergrads. And I'm just curious about this dynamic that you all live in the place where you conduct your research, which is not a given for many faculty members, at any university. And I'm wondering, Tor, if you can talk about what it's meant to you to study and learn from your immediate surroundings, and that, just that's not a given. And when you speak up about what's happening on the coast, it's in the local newspaper, and what is it like for you to be where you conduct your research and share that with students?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's one thing I can say, and this is just to give you a little bit of context. So I started working in this region on the Mississippi Delta a long time ago in the mid 90s when I still lived in Europe. I was based in the Netherlands. And so back then it was totally different from what it's like now. I would fly out here with a group of students. We spent 2 months doing nonstop field work, and then we went back home. And it was very exciting, for all of us, including me. It was being far away from home, and it was a big cultural experience, as you can imagine, coming from a different continent. Later on, I moved to the US. I lived in Chicago for a number of years before I came here, so that brought me a lot closer, but it still took me at least one very long day of driving to get to my field area. And then eventually, I guess it was inevitable that I ended up here right in the middle of this region. And it's made a lot of things different. It's one of the great things is you can just decide on a whim to go out in the field if the weather is nice. For example, I right now I'm planning just one field day with I have a number of new students who I want to kind of introduce to a couple of things. And because of COVID, it's all been a little more difficult, but we're probably going to do this sometime in the next couple of weeks, and we can simply look at the weather forecast. So that obviously was something that we couldn't do back in the day. But there is another side to it, and I think what's really important is that living right in the middle of this region probably makes a difference when I talk to the public about what's going on and what's in our future, which is unfortunately not. It's kind of depressing. The one thing I do feel better about is the fact that I live here too. It affects me as well. Maybe not as bad as the more vulnerable populations that live here, but at least I'm not some kind of outsider who is visiting every once in a while and trying to tell people what's going on. So I'll leave it at that for now, but it's an interesting topic.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that? I'm thinking about how not only just this dynamic of researching where we live and our vested interest in how we do on our coast, but also how we can leverage Tulane's situation here. And I'll add on to that one of the dynamics happening right now is just how clear the climate science is that we need to adapt our ways as human beings. And part of what that brings up is just the need for social scientists, for humanists, for artists to translate what's become known through climate scientists to the public. And AnnieLaurie, that's making me think about your work and just the role, if you can speak to how climate change relates to communication and aesthetics in the liberal arts. And in our school, the fastest growing major is environmental studies, and it's a major priority of Dean Edwards to grow that department, just because of the understanding that of our need to address climate change and understand our environment and surroundings.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the arts and humanities can definitely help to capture things that are understood in other fields and then represent them in ways that communicate the science more broadly and more powerfully. And I think it's very obvious that we've become an increasingly visual culture, and if we're going to successfully shift human patterns and habits, it's really important that we pursue new modes of public communication and engagement. I think that as artists, our aesthetic production also tends to be more personal. It can tell stories in new ways. It can create allegories. It can use more subjective, creative methods that can be really effective at emoting and inspiring people in more personal ways that will hopefully, really help them progress in terms of adaptation. And I'm also really interested in how artists can use their skills to make connections, to connect different issues, to connect with a wider range of people and communities, to bring together disparate forms of research and knowledge to form, sometimes very unexpected connections and create new and bigger pictures. And I think this also, speaks to our position regionally and how we can then extend it to global issues, but use our site specificity here in the Gulf South and at Tulane as a really enigmatic model of both the damages, but also the progress that we can make if we put our minds together, try to make connections, connect with people. And, I think artists and humanists can really make a lot of progress in that regard, kind of with an ultimate goal of connecting scientific knowledge to the human experience. Yeah, I'll stop there.
And I'm thinking of our friends and partners at A Studio in the Woods, which Josh mentioned. It's just such a beloved place for so many of us, and a place where the team there has brought together artists and scientists and just scholars across disciplines to have time to contemplate the world that we're in and re-nourish ourselves. I'm thinking also about, we got a wonderful question. There's a zillion questions coming into the chat, which is, I think, testimony to everyone's expertise, but also just all that we want to learn. But I'm thinking about a question that Laura Murphy raised about what class would all of you teach together, which is a wonderful, wonderful question. And Jelegat, that reminds me of the experience we shared with Laura at the Anthropocene River campus when you led a week-long seminar with Aaron Chang called Unbounded Engineering and Evolutionary Biology. And I'm wondering if you'll speak to that experience of being in a transdisciplinary setting and why that is so important for knowledge production today, to partner with people in other disciplines and learn from one another. And also how, maybe if you'll speak to how it's also vulnerable.
Thank you. And also thank you for inviting me to join the Anthropocene River campus. It was an incredible experience. And that I wish everybody could experience working with, in a room with an engineer, a designer, an anthropologist, an architect, and trying, working together to bring the focus on ecosystems and also the way humans we interact with the river. And, you look at it from my perspective, I would think about, I have to bring the science, and I have to communicate how these interactions are working. And I remember in that space, Aaron telling me that, saying that we could not draw a bird that's moving. And, I'm saying, but birds are important. They're part of the ecosystem. You cannot eliminate one organism from that ecosystem. But it really was a transformative experience in that, when I think about how we communicate climate change and how people think about what scientists are saying, but how about we think about how climate change is affecting our everyday life. And, just going to what Laurie said, is like making music, right? There's a book called, Bugged, and they share the music that has been created through listening to insects, the crickets, the katydids. And so they write music. But what happens when those populations disappear because of climate change? Can you make that music? No, unless you have to change how you're going to create that music, if that's your system. If you look at, you're taking pictures of a landscape. What happens when that landscape disappears? Because one, perhaps it's disappeared into the sea, or that population has completely been wiped out of trees because the water has become, that soil is too acidic, too salty and such. So it's not just that it's in science that we see climate change, but that we also see this in other disciplines, whether it's music, photography, any art, what we consume, and our everyday livelihood. So back to that, looking at the Anthropocene and working with people from other disciplines has really pushed me into a level of always looking for how I can connect with people from any discipline. How can I connect and understand what's happening in science, not just climate change, but interactions, how, you know, the river changes how we live, or did we change the river, or did the river change us?
One more question before we move to more of the questions from the chat. I'm wondering, each of you care so deeply about what's happening, and I'm curious what it takes for you to stay present and engaged and creative with the complex dynamics at hand. So when you experience anxiety, or when your students express that because they're learning, learning more about the world we're in, and around the urgency of our need to adapt, what do you do and what do you recommend? And I just would relate, anyway, I won't prescribe it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I actually saw it. I think I saw a question in the chat that raised the issue of, do we also talk to students about, what they can do? And it caught my attention because this course I've been talking about, it has, I think it has something like 14 like distinct sections. And the very last one has the title, "What can we do?" ? So, the real goal of that is to, to partly lay out some of the large, policy goals that exist out there, things like science fiction, like things like geoengineering, where, people think about putting space mirrors in place to reflect solar radiation, which are, as you can imagine, pretty controversial. So, but then we go down to like, what can we do as individuals? And is there, and the goal is to, because I always try to, have my students walk away from this with a sense of like, there is still, something meaningful that I can contribute. And, one thing, of course, is them taking what they've learned and hopefully share it as widely as they can. But the other thing is that we talk about individual action, that often the cynics will say like, well, what difference does that make? But I think the whole point is to drive home the message, like, look, yes, all these little individual things alone, they are like minuscule drops in a bucket, but if we can do it together, we can come a long way. And there is a very wide range of solutions, and there's not anything that is a silver bullet, but it is about the whole package. And so that's basically the way I try to close it out.
Yeah, so I think artists tend to have a lot of anxiety, including myself. And when I'm trying to combat that, as Tor mentioned, but I think acting, changing our ways and helping others to learn how to change their ways really helps. And for me and for my students, that often involves creation. So sitting down and working on a coloring book about climate change education, trying to design billboards, I think that provides us a hope, for lack of a better word. And in terms of how that translates into action, there's no one single way, but I fully believe that if we promote awareness enough and come up with points of action to promote with our public officials, to hold corporations accountable and come up with corporate incentives, that we can change through political will, that we can change things in more significant ways through even small actions of educating our young people and promoting awareness through all the ways that we're all doing. Yeah.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
You said, how do we combat anxiety in that way? I go out run. But no, seriously, I mean, and you think about it, when I think about even running, I couldn't run if if we continue in the path we're going. But what comes to mind, and something that a principle that I've adopted this year or last year, is transform, not inform. So I think a lot of times when we worry about, what is going to happen, we want to search, we want to inform ourselves, we want to inform others that this is what's happening. However, we can transform the way we process this information. We can transform how we live each day. And it could be, something as like, this semester I have a course called Agroecology and Sustainability in New Orleans. And this course is to really look at how we can increase food safety locally by using small spaces and growing, and that would reduce the reliance on transportation. That would also reduce the use of fertilizer. So those two can reduce carbon and nitrous oxides that are available, but also creating a healthy ecosystem that other organisms can survive, and therefore bringing back this healthy ecosystem, but still producing food. And that also will have an impact with this safe, people knowing that they can produce their food within their own neighborhood or within their own yard. And so again, transforming the thought of, how can we change within the small spaces that we have. So students will say, I don't have a yard to grow my own produce. I don't have a backyard. You can grow some vegetables using containers that you can use for ornamental plants. And therefore you can start producing your own food within the steps of your own house.
And I'll share one, I think probably our final question that's coming in from, or one of our last ones coming in from faculty member Tom Sherry, who asked, should Tulane provide or require all graduates to gain some exposure to climate change and related environmental issues? And what could this look like? And it's interesting. So this is on so many of our minds, that this idea that if students graduate without a firm grasp of climate change, then we failed them. But also there's just like brimming in all directions, so many beautiful ideas about how we might go about this, and how we're already doing it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on it. I'll say this. I don't know exactly how this is going to happen, but it will happen. And I expect that within a decade, there will be some introductory level climate education will be required. It will be part of the core curriculum. And the reason that I think it's going to happen at Tulane is because it's going to happen everywhere. And so whether we voluntarily do it or not, we're going to have to do it because students are going to demand it, and it's going to be expected. So I would anticipate that it's going to become part of the core curriculum for every Tulane student. Now, which form that will take, of course, there's certainly all kinds of different approaches that are possible, but yeah, it's inevitable. And it's to extend this a little bit further, I also expect that by that time that there will be a full-blown undergraduate major in this general area, and something that is, I think it's going to happen pretty fast.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I think, a lot of my interaction with students involves field work here in New Orleans and around New Orleans. And over the years, I've been working with students on service learning projects and other types of fieldwork experiences, looking at, flood damage to communities from Katrina and some of the disparities and injustices that were perpetuated in the recovery process here in New Orleans. And I think, what's key here and where Tulane has a role to play is, the scale of climate change, it is, of course, the grand challenge for all of humanity right now, amongst many other challenges. And we need to prepare students to be effective civic actors and civic participants, whether that be in public agencies that are being set up to address these issues, whether that be a part of like a Green New Deal type policy framework or otherwise. And Tulane and New Orleans are I think a powerful place to for students to pass through, learn, gain wisdom, gain hands-on experience, and face some of those challenges, realistically, but not necessarily stoically. A place that we can understand the gravity of these challenges and the immediacy of these challenges, but also the scale and the need and the possibility for the solutions that we are charged with as a species and as a university and as educators.
It's a beautiful note to end on this evening. I want to thank everyone for coming and attending and just witnessing this glimpse of 4 of our faculty members. And just thank you, panelists, for humanizing what this looks like in our own day-to-day worlds with your students, with your own particular forms of knowledge. One of the wild things we all have to do together is just to listen to one another and learn about where everyone's coming from. And that's just creating these contemplative environments with people from different practices, knowledges, and geographic perspectives is part of our part of what we need to be able to do as human beings to be able to respond to what's happening. So may each of us have the courage to be open-minded and open-hearted, to act from our understandings and absorb the truths of our times, and to do this with kindness within and beyond Tulane's ecosystem. And everyone, I wish you a good evening. Take care and love across place and species and time. And thanks for joining us.